particularly at chapter 1 of Hosea. That means we'll be skipping through the do to do an entire chapter. I'll have to speak quickly or we will not finish in our software's 30-minute limit. And we've entitled it Hosea's Family. The book of Hosea, which means salvation, by the way, is the first of 12 books known in the Old Testament as the Minor Prophets. The first 3 chapters of Hosea compare 2 relationships. First, that of Hosea and an adulterous wife, Gomer, his adulterous wife, Gomer. Secondly, that of God, Yahweh, and his adulterous nation, Israel, the northern kingdom after the split. The first 11 chapters, or the final 11 chapters rather, did you know that there were 14 chapters to Hosea? Yeah, the last 11 are stuffed with prophetic statements about both the northern and the southern kingdoms. The book exudes deep personal agony and the role of personal sorrow, get this, as a means to ministry and divine revelation. You don't think of getting your ministry through sorrow or getting divine revelation through sorrow, although the revelation is probably more likely in your mind than the ministry. If you were to give a single theme to Hosea, it might center on the idea of covenant fidelity as opposed to idolatry, which means faithfulness to God's law compared with false gods. Hosea offers an opening verse and then follows it with what I call 2-verse episodes, 4 of them. And in those, we are introduced to each of the first 4 members added to Hosea's family. The first verse gives us a look at the cultural context for Hosea. It says this in verse 1, "The word of the Lord which came to Hosea the son of Beeri," and by the way, outside of this book, nothing is known about those 2 for certain. "During the days of Uzziah, the king of Judah, is also known as Azariah, during the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah," that's the time span, approximately 100 years, and within that 100 years is where Hosea prophesied. "And during the days of Jeroboam," that would be Jeroboam II, the son of Joash, the king of the northern kingdom, Israel. Hosea was a prophet, as we said, to Israel, the northern kingdom, also called sometimes Ephraim, Joseph, or Samaria. And this was after the split of Judah, as we mentioned. The leader of that split, by the way, and the first king of Israel was Jeroboam I, no relation to our Jeroboam II, as far as we know. Jeroboam I did something, he was an evil king. Every king of the northern kingdom, by the way, was evil. There was never a good, God-fearing king among any of the northern kingdom's kings. Every king did what God considered evil. There were a half a dozen, perhaps, good kings, God-fearing kings in Judah, but not in Israel. One of those kings, Omri, he was a father of Ahab, by the way, who I'm sure you remember, introduced Baal worship, or Baal worship, depending upon how you want to say it, into the kingdom. Jeroboam II, our Jeroboam, was an evil but successful king in many ways. How was he successful? Well, he built a strong military force. Israel was strong militarily. And he built a prosperous economy. But in many ways, Israel as a nation was as unsettled, unjust, and violent as the Judah of Habakkuk's day when Habakkuk raised his complaint. There was great wealth sitting side by side with extreme poverty, very much unjustness going on. And Hosea's prophetic ministry began late in the reign of Jeroboam II, probably no more than 3 years before Jeroboam II died. Into that cultural setting stepped Hosea. What he heard from the Lord must certainly have shook him to the core. Let's look at that. Now we're going to look at 2 verses here. These next 2 verses will bring in his wife as well. So I'm going to read the first half of verse 2. When the Lord first spoke through Hosea, the Lord said to Hosea, "Go take to yourself a wife of harlotry, and have children of harlotry." This command was said to be the first words that God spoke to Hosea, so it must have been the beginning of his ministry. Could be even the event that launched his prophetic career. The Hebrew word for harlotry here is really plural, harlotries. So it says much more than multiple acts of harlotry. It says that there are high levels of immorality generally. So he's to take a wife who will not only be unfaithful to him, but will be highly immoral, perhaps in many ways. At least some of the children were to be born as a consequence of harlotry as well. Not every child that his wife bore would be his. But those children would probably also mimic the immorality of their mother, because the word harlotry relative to children was also in the plural. Some challenge whether God would indeed ever give such a command. They take the book to be an imaginative metaphor, not a physical reality. I think it was a physical reality. Here's a question for you. Matt, how about this for you? How would you as a man have responded to Hosea's mission? Well, and Loretta, what about you? What would you have told your son who received such a command? Think about that as a parent. But the last portion of verse 2 tells us God's reason for the command. Not what it was going to accomplish, not what was going to come because of it, but the reason that he did it. Here is the last part of verse 2. For the land commits flagrant harlotry, forsaking the Lord. That's the beginning of the notion. Hosea is going to have an adulterous wife. God has an adulterous nation. And we're going to be comparing those two back and forth all the way through Hosea. Most of what most Christians know about occurs in the first 3 chapters. The driving factor, again, was that the northern kingdom was chasing false gods. Idolatry settled on Baal, but that meant that they were choosing to walk away from Yahweh. And that's what Yahweh is dealing with at this point in time. And Hosea's marriage was to be an object lesson for Israel that mirrored 2 relationships. The relationship between Hosea and his bride, and the relationship between Yahweh and the nation Israel. Let's look at verse 3. See how Hosea obeyed and responded. So he, that's Hosea, went and took Gomer, the daughter of Diblaim, and she conceived and bore him a son. So there is his wife, Gomer. And all we know about her is what we see here, what she does later, and what her father's name was, even though we don't know anything about him either. So we know virtually nothing about the actors, the human actors in these verses. God spoke in verse 2, Hosea obeyed in verse 3. Now, there are a ton of unknowns at this point. We've been pointing out some of them, and they're going to remain unknown. Cedric, what do you think God specified, or why do you think God specified Gomer as the bride? Or do you think he did? Or did Hosea know Gomer prior to the command and simply choose her? How would he know? There are all sorts of questions. How would he know what Gomer was going to turn out to be like, except for what God said? But did God pick Gomer out? We're not told. Loretta, do you think God set Gomer as a prostitute to marry Hosea? Or do you think she was chaste when they were married? Tons of questions. And by the way, they will never be answered. But there's an elephant in the room now. Was the son that was spoken of born to Gomer, was he the biological son of Hosea? Remember, some of Hosea's kids, at least some of them, were to be born of harlotry. The phrase in verse 3, bore him, that is, bore Hosea a son, would seem to imply that Hosea was the biological father, but it doesn't say so explicitly. But let's check out this first, or not the first, because this one was about Gomer, verses 2 and 3, where one of these 2-verse episodes about Gomer. God spoke to it. Each of the 4 2-verse episodes, God's going to say a bit. So let's look at verse 4, part A, the first half. And the Lord said to him, Hosea, name him, the son, Jezreel. Weird name for a boy, you'd think. For yet a little while, and I will punish the house of Jehu for the bloodshed of Jezreel. What in the world is he talking about? Well, these 2 verses 4 and 5 are loaded with unexplained context and prophecy. The boy's name Jezreel, which by the way means God sows, the J-E generally refers to God. God sows or God scatters. And that's the name of a well-known valley, the Valley of Jezreel, and it separates Galilee from Samaria before the split. Now it's all part of the northern kingdom, but it lies between what we know as Galilee, where Jesus was from, and Samaria, that we know was eventually part of a hated group of people, at least hated by the Jewish people. And there was also a city called Jezreel at like the northern boundary of the valley. Now, Jehu was a man ordained of God. Who ordained him? Well, it was through Elijah and Elisha. And he was ordained as the king of Israel with the purpose of ending Ahab's evil dynasty. He became king, he ended Ahab's dynasty. But in doing what God anointed him to do, he went overboard like, well, Babylon did, Assyria did. He did God's will, but he still was responsible for what happened. He executed a ton of people, starting with Joram, Joram, Jezebel's son, who was king of the northern kingdom at the time, and Uzziah, king of Judah. He killed him too. He ordered the killing of Jezebel and other members of Ahab's family and their supporters, effectively wiping out all of Ahab's dynasty. And then through subterfuge, he executed virtually all of those practicing Baalists, the professional practitioners of Baalism within Israel. Tons of guys again. And by the way, you can find these starting in 2 Kings 9, going through 2 Kings 10. But additionally, he executed members of the royal family of Judah, the southern kingdom, also found in 2 Kings 10. And the slaughter of all of those people took place, most of it, in the valley of, guess it, Jezreel, and the city of Jezreel. In particular, that's where Jezebel got it. Matt, what would you think? What would you name your son? Auschwitz? Would you name your son Treblinka or My? That's what would be very similar to Hosea's naming his son Jezreel, because it named his son after a period of slaughter, and it would have been recognized as such. Well, Jehu did rid Israel of most of the Baal worship, but he made a mistake. He was not all good, by the way, and his dynasty was eventually wiped out. He did not get rid of the golden calves at Bethel and Dan, the two places where Jeroboam I had established temples. So idolatry in one form did continue, but the bulk of the idolatry centered on Baal was wiped out. Not entirely, but wiped out. And by the way, the notions of Baalism runs all the way through Hosea, and because a lot of what happened was based upon the existence of Baalism. Let's read the rest of this 2-verse segment, the second half of verse 4 and then verse 5. And I will put an end to the kingdom of the house of Israel. And it will come about on that day that I will break the bow of Israel in the valley of Jezreel. There it is again. God says, I'm going to wipe Israel as a nation off the map. Israel will no longer exist as a nation. And I'm going to do it in the Jezreel Valley where Jehu's revolt and slaughter took place. So he's reminding people of these things. Now that prophecy, it turns out, of wiping out Israel as a nation took place about 30 years later in 722 BC when Assyria defeated Israel militarily, where? In the valley of Jezreel. And at that time, Assyria carried away many of the Jews from the northern kingdom and substituted Gentiles. That's where the so-called half-breeds of Samaria in the New Testament come from. And by the way, Jeroboam II, who is king when Hosea began his prophetic ministry, was a descendant of Jehu, his grandson, as a matter of fact. In 2 Kings 10, also we find out that God commended Jehu for his efforts to rid Israel of Ahab and Baal. And he promised Jehu's dynasty would last for 4 generations. There were kings named Jehu, Jehoahaz, Jeroboam II, and finally Zechariah. So about a year after Hosea's prophecy was given, Zechariah, the final king, son of Jehu, was murdered. And that called an end to the house of Jehu. You can see some of that in 2 Kings 15, beginning about verse 8. So, everything that he said in that verse actually either happened or was going to happen. There's a ton of goings on there. Now let's go on to the next pair of verses, which will be verses 6 and 7, and we'll look at the next child. And this will be the second child of 3. Then she, Gomer, conceived again and gave birth to a daughter. Notice it doesn't say gave birth to a daughter of Hosea. It just says to a daughter. So was this daughter a biological daughter of Hosea? Likely not, but we don't know. And the Lord said to him, Hosea, name her Lo Ruhamah, for I will no longer have compassion on the house of Israel. He just said he's going to wipe Israel out, that I should ever forgive them. Ruhamah can be translated as pity, compassion, love, that sort of thing. When you add the lo to it, it adds a word no or not. For example, Lo Ruhamah could be translated no compassion, no pity, not loved. It was very clear that that this is a break between Israel and Yahweh. But in the second half of these 2 verses, which we're going to go to 7 now, Yahweh makes a prophecy concerning Judah. He says this, but I will have compassion on the house of Judah, Ruhamah for Judah, and deliver them by the Lord their God, and will not deliver them by bow, sword, battle, horses, or horsemen. He says, I will. That means future. This is a prediction. This is a prophecy. The position of no compassion was restricted to the northern kingdom. Judah's being exempted, and it would continue to receive the compassion of God. And God said, there's going to come a time when I will deliver Judah from a military action without anyone lifting a finger. Well, that's exactly what happened. You can find that in 2 Kings 19. It was a situation where Assyria was attacking Jerusalem, making fun of the God of Jerusalem, making fun of the king of Jerusalem. And in stepped, I'm going to give a word we've talked about a lot in these sessions, Malach Yahweh, the angel of Jehovah, who in one night wiped out 185,000 Assyrian soldiers, putting an end to the siege of Jerusalem, just as God had predicted in Hosea. Now let's look at the last, or the fourth 2-verse event. This is the third child, verses 8 and 9. We'll read verse 8 first. No, we'll read them both. When she, Gomer, had weaned Lo Ruhamah, she conceived and gave birth to a son. And the Lord said, name him Lo, there's that Lo again, Lo Ami, for you are not my people, I am not your God. What does that last verse portion sound like? The breaking of the covenant. You're not my people, I'm not your God. But as with Lo Ruhamah, there's no clue as to whether Lo Ami, the son, is a biological offspring of Hosea. Maybe yes, maybe no. We don't know. Most scholars believe that these last 2 children were not Hosea's biological offspring, but it's a circumstantial case. They don't know. The name Ami, for example, means my people. Therefore, Lo Ami, easy to translate, not my people. Now, has God ever claimed to have removed his love from an individual, let alone an entire nation? Some of you may be saying, no, God would never remove his love. You better go read 2 Samuel 7:15, where God's speaking to David about his son Solomon but references King Saul. You want to read 2 Samuel 7:15, because the answer is yes, God did remove his love from Saul. Now note carefully, the words of the last two verses tell us that the covenant has been broken. Now, can a covenant-keeping God break a covenant? No, of course not. That means that the people of Israel had to have been the covenant breakers. The last expression might best be interpreted, you have decided, this is God speaking, you have decided I will not be your God. In other words, you have said, he's not my God. Some translate it this way, I am no longer I am to you. Remember, that's how they were introduced to Yahweh, through Moses. This is the God called I am. But the transition to chapter 2 has some encouraging words. Let's read from 110 through the first verse of chapter 2. Yet, this is continuing his prophecy, yet the number of the sons of Israel will be like the sand of the sea, which cannot be measured or numbered, and it will come about in the place where it was said to them, you are not my people, it will then be said to them, you are the sons of the living God. Wow, what a switch. He's going to wipe out Israel, but their people will increase fantastically in numbers. Then he says in verse 11, and the sons of Judah and the sons of Israel will be gathered together, and they will appoint for themselves one leader. They will go up from the land, for great will be the day of Jezreel. You want to see that day? Revelation 16, verses 16 and 17. Say to your brothers, Ami, and to your sisters, Ruhamah. So this yet is a pivotal word. In spite of all that Israel has done, eventually God will do good and bring it their way. Important matters were prophesied. Israel numbers will grow without measure. Their status as children of God will be restored. Israel and Judah will be reconciled as one nation, one ruler. Guess who that is? The Messiah sitting on David's throne. And there'll be no divisions between brothers and sisters. When will that likely happen? Well, it looks like the millennial kingdom, after Christ's return and his victory at Armageddon, derived from the Hebrew perhaps as Har Megiddo. You know the term Megiddo. In where? The valley of Jezreel. Again, Revelation 16, 16, 17. In the next lesson, we're going to examine the comparison between Gomer's unfaithfulness and Israel's unfaithfulness. Two pictures of heartache and alienation, but yet the pictures that God gives us. We'll see you at that time.